They've tried new weapons, new tactics, new battlefronts, but the war keeps growing in size and there's no end in sight. By now, we've reached the point where morale has crumbled to where the leaders will try anything, attacking their own men, creating new nations, freeing prisoners, anything to be able to continue the war. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week, the 9th Battle of the Isonzo River began and ended with the Italians nearly breaking through the Austrian lines, but the Austrians being saved by reinforcements in the nick of time. The Romanians held their own in the mountains, the Bulgarians were pushed back in the Balkans, and German flying ace Oswald Belke met his fate. It had been quiet at the Somme, but it wasn't quiet this week. British Commander-in-Chief Sir Douglas Haig had determined that the 7th British attack on the Germans at the Transloy line would take place November 5th, and as usual, he set objectives beyond the line itself. The fact that finally taking Transloy would not end the ordeal provoked Lord Cavan, whose men would actually carry out the attack, to speak up. He insisted to Haig's second-in-command Sir Henry Rawlinson that there was no chance of success in the attack. And though Cavan realized that they must support the French even if it meant a sacrifice, this sacrifice would do nothing much to assist the French and would destroy morale in the men. Rawlinson didn't budge and sent for a small test attack on the 3rd to see what might be expected on the 5th. And what might be expected was failure, because that's just what happened to the test attack. Cavan said he wouldn't attack until Rawlinson had personally seen conditions on the front. So Rawlinson turned up, looked around and said, "Yeah, let's not do this attack." He convinced Haig not to do it as well, but then Haig changed his mind and the attack was back on. And you can guess how it went. It failed, with a couple thousand casualties. The Germans did not budge. The Germans were trying not to budge elsewhere this week in Dobrogea against the Russian and Romanian forces. But there were problems with the Russians by now. The German advance had threatened to break the Allied lines, so Russia had to call off any strikes further north against Hungary on the southeastern front to plug the gap here. German General August von Mackensen's Bulgarian forces were poised to cut off Bucharest from the sea, and by this point it seemed like only big Russian reinforcements could prevent a Romanian collapse. 26 Russian infantry divisions and 11 cavalry divisions were now heading south. However, the Romanian railways that took them there could only handle 19 trains a day, and each Russian corps required 130 trains to move. So there literally was no means of getting the Russian troops to Romania. In any case, the Romanians had only provided 30 actual trains, so Russian soldiers had to arrive all the way from Czernowitz on foot. By November 9th, only the Russian 4th Corps had arrived, and they were sufficient to hold the Bulgarians south of the Danube. No one knew if any more Russians would arrive in time. Still though, Mackensen's line was actually giving way a bit this week to Russo-Romanian pressure. He retreated through Topal and was now only 20 kilometers north of the Cernavodă-Constanța railway. On the other Romanian front, in the mountains, the Germans resumed their offensive, and the situation there still looked like it was anybody's game. And it was probably just as well that Russia was no longer on the offensive on the Eastern Front. On the 5th, British observer Colonel Knox wrote in his diary, "The plain truth is that without airplanes and far more heavy guns and shell and some knowledge of their use, it is butchery and useless butchery to drive Russian infantry against German lines." Knox was told by General Nikolai Dukhonin, Russian Quartermaster General, that since the beginning of June, Russian killed and wounded exceeded 1 million men. But they had not just held out against the Central Powers. The Russian summer offensive had steamrolled the Austrians and come close to knocking the Empire out of the war. And by this point, the Central Powers no longer had confidence in a decisive breakthrough because of French and British perseverance in the West, Brusilov's Russian advance in the east, and Italian tenacity in the mountains. The Kaiser thought maybe there was a political solution to the war, winning over the Polish to the German cause. General Erich von Ludendorff dreamed of a Polish army under German leadership that could fight in the east so Germany could concentrate in the west. On November 5th, Germany and Austria-Hungary announced that Poland will be established as an independent state with Warsaw as capital. But Germany would keep a tight grip on her, and the Poles wanted political power, not just military. Polish military leader Józef Pilsudski said, "No army without a government to command it." When government was denied, Pilsudski withdrew his 10,000-strong brigade from Ludendorff's command. This whole scenario backfired on the Germans because German Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg had been exploring the option of a separate peace with the Russians. But think about it. Whatever the land agreement in that peace would be, does anyone think the Tsar would have agreed to an independent Poland being carved out of the west of his empire? Furthermore, informal and secret talks had already taken place in Stockholm between German industrialist Hugo Stinnes and the vice president of the Russian Duma, A.D. Protopopov, but they were now discontinued. Vladimir Lenin was actually relieved about all of this in exile in Switzerland because he was worried that a separate peace between Germany and Russia would ruin the chance for a Russian revolution. Wheels within wheels. But everyone needed new men to fight the war. And, well, the Poles would have helped. Look at Austria-Hungary. On just the Isonzo River against the Italians, the Austrians had lost 130,000 men since August and had no real hope of replenishing their losses. But Italian Chief of Staff Luigi Cadorna's advantages were not as strong as they appeared. His recruits were poorly trained. Likewise, the new officers, and the little ground gained for enormous casualties was far from a limited success at a reasonable cost. And he still blamed failure on the infantry's lack of fighting spirit, and the impact of all of this on the morale of his men was obvious. None of Cadorna's offensives had given the men the feeling they'd actually won something. And since Italy was fighting an aggressive war, if they were not advancing, then they were, by definition, failing. A lieutenant fighting on the Carso summed it up. It's not the dying that is the demoralizing thing, the thing that grinds you down. It is dying so uselessly for nothing. This is not dying for the fatherland. It is dying for the stupidity of specific orders and the cowardice of specific commanding officers. By now, there were even mutinies. Last week, 6 men were executed for mutiny, and Cadorna issued a directive that commanders had to decimate mutinous units. Morale was falling everywhere. For 2 years at Wohlleben POW camp in Berlin, prisoners kept their spirits up by hoping the war would soon end. But after the British and Germans agreed to exchange all civilian prisoners over 45 years old, everyone else realized that they were going to be there for a long time. One guy sent home, Israel Cohen, wrote on November 6 in the preface to the first published history of Wohlleben camp, "Hundreds of tragedies are being slowly and secretly enacted behind the brick walls and barbed wire fence of Wohlleben, of men torn from their families, reft of their livelihood, and tormented daily by gnawing anxiety about the future struggle for which physical privation and mental depression are rendering them more and more unfit." And here are some notes to end the week. On November 5th at Verdun, the French occupied the whole of Vaud. On the 6th came the defeat and death of Ali Dinar, former Sultan of Darfur, near the frontier at Wadai. That same day, the liner Arabia was sunk by torpedoes off the Greek coast. On the 7th, Woodrow Wilson was elected to a second term as United States President. And on the 9th, Portuguese troops were now ready to leave for the Western Front. And a busy week of the war ends, with British failure at the Somme, logistical problems for Romania and Russia, a glimmer of hope for the Poles, and morale crumbling everywhere. There is a quick fix for that. On the Italian front, the men on the lines knew they were going to attack soon when the military police mounted machine guns behind them, ready to shoot at soldiers who hesitated when the charge was called. There's no hard data on how many men were killed this way, but in memoirs and diaries, you get an impression. The White War recounts that in one minor action in the Dolomites, 80 men were killed by enemy machine guns and 25 by the military police. Cadorna said, When a soldier lacks the spirit and will to fight, he lacks everything. Unlike most Cadorna-isms, this is actually pretty true, but he also believed in the converse, that having spirit and will made soldiers unstoppable, and this is one great falsehood of modern war. More often than not, the soldiers would break under these conditions and suffer from what was then called shell shock. If you want to find out more about the psychological effects of modern war, you can click here to watch our special episode about that. Our Patreon supporter of the week is Randolph Guevara. Thanks to Randolph's and your support, we can now make this show better and better and cooler, and I put my thumbs up like this more often, the more money we get. So please support us on Patreon as well, because every little bit helps.